Opening the king's diagonal dramatically creates immediate central influence and initiates a dynamic battle for space. Immediately establishing asymmetrical pawn structures, the Sicilian defense injects immediate dynamic tension, preparing to contest central squares with flank pressure. Initiating rapid kingside development and preparing central pawn thrusts, this natural knight maneuver surveys potential tactical avenues. Opening the e-file for the queen and preparing a pawn chain, this maneuver signals a desire for a more closed position. Challenging the center now directly opens lines, forcing black to decide between pawn capture or strategic development. Black opens a diagonal for their queen and bishop, accepting the central challenge by relinquishing space for counterplay. Immediately reclaiming the pawn with the knight sets up an active piece in the center, preparing for rapid development. Developing the knight to a central square, it contests d4 and prepares for nf6, a classic response to the open Sicilian's positional demands. Solidifying central control, this knight reroutes to reinforce the pawn chain and eye potential queenside expansion. Preparing to expand queenside space prevents white's cavalry from finding comfortable outposts. Developing the bishop to e3 actively eyes the queenside and prepares to castle, creating a solid structure while maintaining flexibility in case black tries to disrupt white's center with moves like b5. Developing the knight to its most active square, this move signals a readiness to contest the center and prepare for kingside castling, a logical response to white's aggressive pawn structure. Challenging black's central pawn structure while simultaneously preparing a queenside expansion, this move aims to seize the initiative and pressure black's king early. Unlocking central space, black boldly advances the e-pawn, immediately challenging white's knight and forging a more active pawn chain to contest the open lines that are rapidly developing. Unleashing a knight's advanced post, white immediately challenges black's central pawn structure, aiming to disrupt its harmony and potentially exploit the exposed king. Challenging the knight's advanced post, this pawn push initiates a crucial battle for central squares and aims to disrupt white's established knight outpost. It simultaneously opens lines for black's pieces, particularly the queen and bishop, while subtly hinting at a potential kingside fianchetto to bolster defense. The move forces white to react, potentially sacrificing tempo or positional advantage to address the immediate threat to their knight. Instantly sacrificing knightly presence on f5, white redirects the knight to the edge of the board, seeking an unusual outposting maneuver on h6. This aggressive repositioning aims to bypass black's central pawn chain and potentially threaten the kingside, but it relinquishes central control and leaves the knight somewhat exposed to future discoveries if black can organize counterplay. The long-term wisdom of this sortie hinges on white's ability to exploit the generated positional imbalance before black can consolidate. The knight's advance to d4 challenges the central pawn structure and eyes potential weaknesses, aiming to disrupt white's harmonious development. This knight reroutes for active participation, potentially supporting future pawn pushes or attacking key squares. It's a proactive piece maneuver, seeking to equalize space and create counterplay. Exchanging the bishop here clarifies the pawn structure on the kingside, potentially opening a pathway for the queen to exert influence or creating a sanctuary for your king. Consider how this piece removal impacts central control and the long-term prospects for both sides' development. Reclaiming the central pawn dramatically alters the pawn structure, creating a double d-pawn for black, but opening a diagonal for their queen. White must now carefully consider how to address this new imbalance, perhaps by challenging the doubled pawns or by exploiting the open lines. Opening up the c-file for your rooks becomes significantly more appealing with this knight jump, subtly threatening to infiltrate black's queenside weaknesses and potentially pinning down pieces on the d4 square. The black queen, taking advantage of the knight's forced retreat, surges forward, immediately challenging the white king's sanctuary by delivering a direct check. This audacious maneuver instantly disrupts white's development and forces a reaction, seizing the initiative. Slinging the pawn forward dares black's queen to trespass, essentially forcing a decision on whether to retreat or accept a potentially awkward outpost for Her Majesty. while simultaneously expanding white's pawn majority on the queen side and preparing to contest the d-file. Unveiling a fascinating tactical sequence, black sacrifices the bishop to shatter white's pawn structure and gain critical initiative. This daring check forces white into a defensive posture, disrupting their central control and opening lines for black's remaining pieces. The resulting disarray in white's pawn formation on the queen side will likely become a long-term weakness, demanding careful maneuvering from white to compensate. Black, by contrast, has activated their queen and potentially opened a pathway for their rooks. This sharpens the game considerably, shifting the focus to active piece play and the exploitation of positional imbalances rather than a slower positional buildup. Relocating the monarch from the center's perilous embrace, the king seeks a sanctuary behind the developing pawn shield, simultaneously offering protection to the beleaguered c3 knight. The knight's daring raid into white's central stronghold, now solidified by the pawn chain, initiates a dynamic reshuffling of forces, aiming to exploit the newly created open diagonal and the exposed nature of the white king. Unleashing a daring king hunt, white sacrifices the queen, opening a diagonal straight to black's vulnerable monarch, and initiating a sharp tactical sequence that demands precise calculation from both sides. The forced relocation of the black king to d8, while seemingly a minor inconvenience, creates a significant exposure of the monarch, now lurking on an open file and susceptible to the relentless pressure from white's queen and bishop battery. Capture of the pawn creates a fascinating dynamic, drawing the white queen deep into black's territory where it's now vulnerable to attack from both the knight and the newly repositioned queen. This exchange might seem aggressive, but it opens lines and forces black to react, potentially sacrificing material for positional advantage and a more active piece development in return for the exposed white monarch. The white king's safety is now the paramount concern, as any misstep could lead to a swift checkmate. The queen is captured, drastically altering the material balance and opening up the game. This exchange, while seemingly forced after white's audacious gambit, creates a significantly different positional landscape, potentially favoring white in the long run due to their king's slightly safer central placement and the possibility of developing their remaining pieces with more freedom. Black must now focus on consolidating their position and activating their pieces swiftly, as white's development advantage might become a serious threat in the ensuing, more open middle game. A critical juncture, white strategically recaptures, opening a critical e-file and confronting black's momentarily exposed king while simultaneously solidifying central control. Black's rook now eyes the open f-file, a crucial avenue for piece activity in this unsettled position, aiming to challenge white's slightly exposed king and potentially liberate the d4 pawn. Bolstering the kingside defense and preparing for pawn advances, this move seeks to create a more solid pawn structure against black's potentially active rook. Black's pawn structure now presents a fascinating web of interconnected weaknesses and potential strengths. The d6 pawn, while creating a slight blockade for white's light-squared bishop and king, also isolates the c-pawn and forms a potentially vulnerable chain. Opening up the queenside with this pawn push is a bid to seize space and potentially develop piece activity, but it comes with a significant positional cost, creating weaknesses that could be exploited. The black king, finally escaping the center's initial chaos, now seeks refuge on the queenside, a strategic pivot that aims to connect its rook with the active queenside pawn majority and solidify a less exposed position than it previously held. Unlocking the b-file's potential with the bishop's repositioning addresses the lingering weakness on that diagonal and aims to disrupt black's nascent kingside control. Black's bishop now finds a more useful outpost, preparing to eye the kingside and support its central pawn structure while simultaneously defending against potential discoveries on the b-file. Developing the kingside pawns now is a double-edged sword, aiming to disrupt black's bishop's diagonal influence while simultaneously creating potential weaknesses around your own monarch if not carefully supported. Reclaiming the center and preparing to challenge the open files are key objectives here, so bringing the rook to the e-file makes perfect sense. Consolidating its central presence, the bishop now aims to control the crucial dark squares leading toward black's castle, or rather, uncastled, king. Reclaiming the initiative, black redirects the rook to the central files, aiming to disrupt white's developing pieces and create counterplay on the open e-file. Initiating a daring pawn storm on the kingside, white aims to shatter black's defensive shell and expose the monarch to further artillery. This maneuver is a bold attempt to reclaim the initiative on the e-file, aiming to dislodge white's encroaching bishop and challenge control of that vital open column. Black repositions their rook, preparing for a potential exchange or to further pressure white's king. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside, white aims to pry open the defender's king, potentially leading to a decisive attack, even at the cost of weakening their own pawn structure and creating targets. Unlocking the kingside pawn structure creates a dynamic confrontation, but be acutely aware of the inherent risks associated with exposing your monarch. The rook's aggressive thrust into the enemy camp, bypassing the pawn chain, immediately ignites a tactical skirmish, threatening to unravel black's king's defenses and disrupt the coordination of their pieces. Sacrificing the exchange now unleashes a torrent of tactical possibilities, transforming a tense middle game into a sharp, dynamic struggle where piece activity and initiative reign supreme over material advantage. Exploiting the open file with relentless pawn advancement, this capture decisively opens the h-file for white's rook, promising swift and dangerous penetration towards black's beleaguered king. Emerging from a chaotic exchange, black's knight, now relocated to the e5 square, seeks a more active role, potentially eyeing the d3 bishop and aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure. The monarch bravely ventures forward, seeking active participation in the unfolding contest, a bold decision given the lingering threats on the central files. Unburdening the king of its passive defender suddenly frees up the rook to initiate a daring outpost on the kingside, aiming to exploit the rather exposed enemy monarch. A bold repositioning, the knight abandons its outpost to challenge black's doubled pawns and potentially disrupt their nascent attacking structure by opening up the kingside for a future assault. Retreating the rook to the fourth rank is a prudent decision, aiming to reposition this valuable piece to a more defensively secure square while simultaneously preparing for potential exchanges or regrouping along the open files. Reclaiming the open file is paramount after the rook exchange. This aggressive repositioning aims to threaten the enemy monarch directly, bypassing any lingering defensive structures. Black decides to grab a pawn, but this opens up the file for the rook and puts immediate pressure on the weakened pawn structure around white's king. This gambit-style play, while superficially attractive for regaining material, might leave black's own king a bit exposed in the long run, and the coordination of black's pieces needs careful attention to prevent counterplay. The knight now scurries to a potentially active square, eyeing the weak pawns and hinting at future attacks on the kingside, while simultaneously offering a defensive post should the need arise. Disrupting white's pawn structure and opening a dangerous line towards the exposed king, this check forces immediate attention and potentially throws the white king's hard-won safety into further jeopardy. Relocating the monarch to this square initiates a fascinating endgame scenario where controlling the central files becomes paramount, potentially offering white a slight initiative despite the material deficit. The bishop's discovery from its back rank confinement now forces the white king into a precarious position, highlighting the crucial weakness created by white's earlier aggressive queen sortie.